My wife spent years calling me useless, until the day she walked into a boardroom and saw me sitting at the head of the table. That was the moment she realized the man she dismissed was now her boss. I used to believe marriage was supposed to be a safe place, a quiet harbor where the storms of life couldn't touch us. That's what I thought, at least, until I realized that sometimes the person you share a roof with can be the sharpest storm of them all. My wife, Elena, and I had been married for 7 years. On paper, we looked like a steady couple. 2 working professionals, no children yet, a modest house in the suburbs. I worked in operations for a mid-sized firm. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. Elena, though, she was ambitious. She worked for a rising company downtown, sleek offices, late-night meetings, endless corporate buzz. And she wore that ambition like a badge, one she made sure everyone could see. It started small, the comments. A casual remark over dinner. "Mark, you should think about moving up, you know? My boss started where you are, but look at him now. Some people just have drive." She smiled as she said it, but her eyes lingered too long, her tone a little too sharp. At first, I brushed it off. Couples tease, right? We all say things we don't mean. But these moments multiplied. Soon, they weren't jokes anymore. They were assessments. Comparisons. And every comparison was a reminder that in her eyes, I was falling short. One night, I came home late. Traffic had been brutal, and I walked in tired, carrying takeout because I knew Elena would be too busy with her laptop to cook. I set the bags on the counter and said, "Brought dinner." She didn't even look up from her screen. "Mark, you're 35. You're still stuck at the same job, same salary. Don't you ever want more for yourself?" Her words cut deeper than she realized. Or maybe she did realize. Maybe that was the point. I stood there, holding the greasy paper bags, feeling like an intruder in my own home. The word came a week later, during one of our arguments. It was late. I had asked her why she always seemed irritated with me, why every conversation circled back to how I wasn't good enough. She slammed her glass down on the counter, wine sloshing over the rim. "Because you're useless, Mark," she shouted. "Useless. You don't push yourself, you don't take risks, you just sit in your little comfort zone. Sometimes I feel like I married a shadow." Silence followed. Heavy, suffocating silence. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just stared at her, memorizing the shape of her mouth as she formed those words. Useless. She turned away, muttering, "God, even my boss has more fire than you do. At least he knows what it means to be ambitious." I said nothing. Not because I agreed, but because deep down I knew something had shifted. A seed had been planted inside me, watered by her contempt. That seed wasn't rage, not yet. It was something colder. A resolve I hadn't felt before. I went to bed that night without touching the food. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft hum of her laptop from the next room. She thought she had broken me. She thought her words would keep me small. But what she didn't realize was that in calling me useless, she had given me the one thing I had been missing all along. A reason to change. The week after she called me useless, the air in our house thinned. Elena moved through rooms like she was late for a plane. Our conversations shrank to logistics, groceries, a package on the porch, a coworker's cat that needed watching. When she did look at me, it was as if she was checking the time. The first real fracture happened at her friend Mara's birthday. We stood in a circle under the restaurant's warm lights, each of us holding a glass. When it was Elena's turn to toast, she lifted her flute with a bright smile that didn't reach her eyes. "To Mara," she said, Proof that if you want something, you work for it. Some people wait around for luck. Others make it happen. Laughter bubbled. It was the harmless kind, the kind that chooses to miss the point. I felt the heat creep up my neck. Elena didn't glance at me, not once. She knew I'd heard it. She'd meant me to. On the ride home, she hummed with that particular kind of satisfaction that follows a performance. Streetlights slid across her face, gold bars moving across a vault door. "You know," she said, tapping a message into her phone, "Adrian says there's a dinner next week. Big clients, senior leadership. Spouses come too. I'm going to introduce you." "Adrian," I repeated, careful with the name. "Your boss." She smiled at the windshield. "He appreciates initiative." The way she said it made initiative sound like oxygen, as if the rest of us were choosing not to breathe. I bought a new tie for the dinner. Navy, subtle. I ironed my shirt until the seams looked like decisions. When we stepped into the ballroom, it was a forest of glass and soft light. Waiters moved like chess pieces. A string quartet made the air behave. Elena's hand slipped from my arm the moment she saw her colleagues. She belonged to the room in a way I never did. She laughed the right length at the right volume, touched elbows when she needed to, rested her palm on a shoulder when a point landed. I stood beside her, not embarrassed, not proud, simply present. "Adrian!" she called, bright as a bell. He turned. Mid-40s, fit. An easy tan that said he knew where to find sun in winter. His smile carried the casual entitlement of men who learn early that rooms rearrange for them. "Elena," he said, sliding an arm half around her as if measuring an investment. "And you must be—" "Mark," I said, offering my hand. "Her husband." "Operations, right?" he said. "Important work. Invisible when it's done well." A small laugh rippled through the circle around us. There's a particular smile people use when they want to be kind while being cruel. I had never liked that smile. Elena's fingers closed around my elbow, light, corrective pressure, then released. "Adrian's the reason our quarter beat projections," she said to the group, not to me. "You should see how he handles pressure." "I prefer to avoid it," I said. "Pressure means something upstream broke." Adrian's eyebrows rose, amused. "Spoken like a man who fixes pipes." It wasn't clever, but it landed the way he wanted. The conversation shifted, leaving me on the quiet side of the circle. I moved to the bar, asked for club soda with lime, and let the room wash over me. When I looked back, Elena was laughing at something Adrian had said, her head tipped, her hand on his sleeve. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was everything. I drifted, listening. It's a habit you learn in operations. Most problems introduce themselves if you let them. Near the silent auction table, two men in suits spoke low and fast. "Vendor terms shortened again," one muttered. "We're juggling float." "Payroll timing's tight," said the other. "CFO says we're fine." CFO always says we're fine. I noted it. Not with delight, not with some cinematic flash of revelation. Just a mark in a ledger. A company that brags loudly, often spends loudly. Elena found me near a display of whiskey bottles. "You disappeared," she said, smiling, but her eyes scanned over my shoulder. "Come meet someone." She led me to a couple whose names blurred in my memory, and then to a director who had recently joined from a competitor. I watched Elena switch masks with each introduction, calibrating to status like a thermostat. The night went on like that, names, smiles, the murmur of money. Every so often, I felt her hand on my back, steering me, as one might steer a luggage cart. Later, when the speeches began, Adrian took the stage. Elena's posture changed. She became very still, like a photograph of attention. "Growth," he said, "isn't an accident. It's discipline, it's hunger, it's refusing to accept average." Applause followed. Elena glanced at me then. A brief flick, an audit. I wondered what number she assigned me in that moment, what rounding error my presence represented. Afterward, while people crowded the exits, Adrian stepped close. "We're building something that will redefine our space," he said to Elena. "I need lieutenants who don't flinch." She glowed. "You know I don't." He looked at me, not unkindly, but as if I were a framed photo on a desk, pleasant, inert. "Elena tells me you're steady." "Steady keeps airplanes in the air," I said. He laughed. "And ambition builds them." Then, to Elena, "Take Monday's 7 a.m. call. Don't be late." On the drive home, Elena was a string pulled tight. "You were quiet," she said. "I was listening." "To what?" "How people talk when they're certain." She scoffed. "You could try sounding impressed." "I am impressed," I said, by how close the applause was to the word hunger. She turned to the window. "God, Mark, this is what I mean. You don't get it. You're safe. Safe is boring." I didn't answer. I was thinking about the men by the auction table, about the weight behind their words. I was thinking how companies often confuse velocity with progress. 2 days later, the humiliation picked up speed. Elena posted a photo from the dinner, her in a black dress, Adrian at her side, the caption, "Find the people who raise your ceiling." Comments poured in. At Mara's place the next weekend, someone asked me, smiling, if I'd thought about applying to Elena's company. "They could use a steady guy like you, someone to fix the pipes." Laughter. I smiled back. I had learned the shape of that smile now, how it sits on a face like a stamp that won't come off. That night, Elena came home late. I sat at the kitchen table with a ledger open. Our finances, my notes from work, a few lines about a small supplier I'd been advising on the side. She saw the papers and smirked. "Budgeting?" she said. "How thrilling." I closed the book. "You're tired," I said. "We can talk tomorrow." She leaned on the counter, assessing me like a manager who'd inherited underperforming assets. "Adrian says the people who hesitate are dead weight," she said. "I think he's right." There it was again, the sermon delivered through a borrowed mouth. I stood, gathered the ledger, and slid it into a drawer. "Good night, Elena." She laughed, low. "You know what your problem is, Mark. You think in lines. Successful people think in leaps." When she went upstairs, I stayed. The house was quiet, but for the fridge's patient hum, I pulled the ledger back out and added 2 more lines under a column I hadn't shown her. Names of potential investors. Industry contacts. Notes from an old friend who'd built a fund and kept a modest profile. I wrote without hurry. I wrote the way a person breathes. The next morning, Elena moved around me with exaggerated efficiency. Keys, bag, perfume, heels. At the door, she paused. "Try not to be late tonight," she said. "We're going to Mara's again. They want to hear Adrian's podcast. You could stand to learn something." "I'm sure I could," I said. "Everyone can learn something." She held my gaze for a second too long, then left. By then, the humiliation had done its work. It had scrubbed something raw inside me, leaving a surface that would hold ink. I don't pretend I didn't hurt. I did. But pain is a focusing tool when you let it be. I decided to let it. I was 35 years old when my wife's words finally stopped echoing and started hardening into resolve. My name is Mark Lawson, and until then, I had played my life like a background note. Steady, predictable, never the melody. I thought stability was love's currency. I thought loyalty was enough. But the night Elena called me useless, something inside me shifted. The world she worshipped, the world of her boss and boardrooms and endless ambition. It had always seemed like noise to me. Suddenly, it sounded like a challenge. I started small. Each night, after Elena drifted upstairs with her phone glued to her hand, I stayed at the kitchen table. I spread out notes, made calls, studied markets, mapped opportunities. I had always been good with systems, with operations, finding leaks before they became floods. For years, I used that skill to protect a company that didn't belong to me. Now, I wondered what might happen if I used that same discipline for myself. It wasn't about proving Elena wrong. Not yet. It was about reclaiming the parts of me I had allowed to rust. My father used to say, "Mark, you don't need to be the loudest man in the room. Just be the one who's still standing when the noise fades." He died when I was 22, and his words had lived quietly in me ever since. That night, they came alive. I reached out to an old friend from college, Daniel in Nantes. Daniel had gone into private equity and built a reputation for spotting undervalued companies. We hadn't spoken in years, but when he heard my voice, his laugh came warm and genuine. "Mark Lawson, the most reliable guy in our dorm? What's got you calling me after a decade?" "An idea," I said simply. "One that needs discipline more than flash." He listened, and for the first time in years, I felt like my words mattered. He didn't laugh at my stability. He called it an asset. He told me something I'd never forgotten. Flash burns out. Steady builds empires. That night, while Elena was upstairs watching Adrian's motivational videos, I was laying bricks of my own foundation. Quietly, patiently. But the turning point wasn't just about ambition. It was about seeing my marriage for what it had become. One evening, Elena came home late again, perfume clinging to her like a flag of another life. She dropped her bag on the counter and glanced at the ledger I'd left open by mistake. Numbers, projections, names. "What's this?" she asked, her voice carrying that mix of amusement and disdain she reserved for me. "Plans," I said simply. She smirked. "You? Plans? Mark, don't kid yourself. You don't have the guts." Her laugh was the last straw. Not because she doubted me, but because I realized in that moment she no longer saw me at all. To her, I wasn't a man. I was a fixture, furniture that carried a paycheck. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just closed the ledger and said, "Good night, Elena." But upstairs in the dark, I made a promise. Not to her, to myself. A promise that by the time she looked at me again, she wouldn't recognize the man standing in front of her. It was no longer enough to endure. It was time to build, time to rise, and time to prepare for the day when the woman who called me useless would have no choice but to call me boss. The days became routine, but beneath the surface my life split into two timelines. On one hand, I was still the same man Elena saw. Steady Mark, the husband who never raised his voice, who still drove the same car, who still ironed his shirts on Sunday nights. But behind closed doors, after she fell asleep or vanished into her late-night calls, I was laying the blueprint of a life she couldn't imagine. I started with observation. Adrian's company, her world, her shrine, wasn't as invincible as the speeches made it sound. From the whispers I'd caught at the dinner and the filings I quietly pulled afterward, I could see the cracks. Debt ratios that didn't line up. Supplier contracts renewed at harsher terms. Too much money moving too fast, like someone sprinting downhill. The kind of growth that burns itself alive. Every evening I studied balance sheets, competitor reports, industry analysis. I wasn't chasing ambition for ambition's sake, I was dissecting it. My operations background gave me an eye for inefficiency, for pressure points, and Adrian's empire had plenty. Daniel became my confidant. We spoke in quiet, clipped conversations, always at odd hours. "You're serious about this?" he said one night, his voice carrying equal parts curiosity and caution. "I've never been more serious." He whistled low. "Mark, people build and people bleed in this game. You're not just buying stock, you're playing with a company's soul." I thought of Elena then, her laughter at Adrian's side, the way she looked at me as if I were already obsolete. Then I'll treat it like surgery, clean, precise, no wasted cuts. We began assembling resources, not flashy money, quiet money. Investors who liked shadows, not headlines. Men and women who respected steady hands over flamboyant gestures. It amazed me how quickly doors opened once I stopped doubting myself. People could smell conviction, and for the first time in my life I reeked of it. Meanwhile, Elena remained blind. She was too busy basking in Adrian's glow, chasing his approval like a moth hurling itself at a porch light. She spent more nights at the office, more weekends claiming she was networking, while I was meeting partners in discreet restaurants, signing non-disclosure agreements and outlining takeover strategies. One night, she came home buzzing, cheeks flushed, her words tumbling over themselves. "Adrian thinks I could make VP in 2 years, she said, pouring herself a glass of wine. 2 years, Mark, can you imagine?" I nodded, hiding the storm beneath my calm. 2 years, I thought. By then, Adrian won't even own the chair he's sitting in. I began to change in small ways, though I kept them subtle. I upgraded my suits, not dramatically, but tailored now, sharper lines. I carried myself differently, sat straighter, spoke with weight when I did speak. Elena noticed, but not in the way I expected. "You look different," she said one evening, eyes narrowing. "What's gotten into you?" "Nothing," I replied, "just taking better care of myself." She shrugged, already back to her phone. That dismissal, once painful, now fueled me. The less she saw, the freer I was. As weeks turned into months, our house became a theater of silence. She rehearsed her ambition in front of mirrors. I rehearsed my revenge in ledgers and late-night calls. The distance between us wasn't measured in feet, but in futures. There was a night that sealed it. I was in the study, reviewing a draft of the acquisition plan Daniel's team had drawn up. Elena walked in unexpectedly, holding her glass of wine. Her eyes skimmed the papers before I could cover them. "What is all this?" she asked. "Work," I said evenly. She laughed, a sharp sound. "Since when do you work on anything past 9? Don't tell me you're trying to impress me now." Her mockery rolled off me this time. I didn't flinch, I just closed the folder gently and met her gaze. "Maybe I'm trying to impress myself." For a moment, something flickered in her expression. Confusion? Suspicion? But then she shook her head, muttering, "God, you're weird," and walked out. The door clicked shut, and I smiled. Piece by piece, the plan crystallized. We targeted Adrian's weakest flank, an over-leveraged expansion project overseas. His board had approved it hastily, drunk on growth. If we moved fast, we could tighten the noose before he even realized who was holding the rope. Daniel called one night, his voice steady. "It's lining up, Mark. You'll need to step forward soon. This won't be a shadow game much longer." I looked at myself in the mirror as he spoke. Same face, same eyes. But the man staring back wasn't the one Elena had called useless. He was someone sharper, harder, honed by contempt and silence. "Let me know when," I said. "I'll be ready." I hung up and leaned back in my chair, the quiet of the house wrapping around me. Upstairs, Elena laughed at something Adrian had said on speakerphone. Her laugh carried down the stairs like a dare. She thought she was aligning herself with power. What she didn't know was that power had already shifted, and soon she would find herself looking up at the very man she had spent years looking down on. The final moves unfolded like a chess game, where only I knew the rules. Adrian's company strutted in the spotlight, trumpeting their overseas expansion, while behind the scenes, Daniel and I pulled threads one by one. Contracts were renegotiated, creditors whispered their doubts, and small but vital partners began to drift toward us. By the time Adrian noticed the pressure, the ground had already shifted beneath him. It started with a phone call. "Mark," Daniel said, "the acquisition window is open. If you want to move, it has to be now." I stared at the folders spread across my desk, pages thick with signatures and projections. My pulse didn't quicken, it slowed. This was no longer adrenaline. This was inevitability. "Do it," I said. The following weeks passed in silence to the outside world. But in boardrooms and conference calls, my name surfaced with growing frequency. Mark Lawson, the steady operator, the quiet strategist, wasn't invisible anymore. By the time Adrian's board received the official notice, the majority of their leverage had already slipped into my hands. Elena remained oblivious. At home, she still spoke Adrian's name with reverence. One night, she returned from the office, glowing as though she carried his approval like perfume. "He says I might take lead on the expansion project," she gushed, pouring herself wine. "Imagine that, Mark, me, running point on an international rollout." I sipped my water and offered a faint smile. Inside, the irony cut deep. By the time that rollout begins, Elena, the man you idolize, won't even have a desk to sit at. The day of the acquisition announcement was a study in contrasts. Adrian strode into the headquarters as though nothing had changed. His employees milled about nervously, whispers chasing one another through the hallways. In a private board meeting, his face drained as the reality settled in. His empire now belonged to someone else. I wasn't there to witness it, not yet. I wanted my presence reserved for one stage only. At home that evening, Elena mentioned the rumors. "People are saying something's happening, a shakeup, but Adrian told us not to worry." "Of course," I said, folding my shirt with care. "That's what leaders do." She nodded, reassured by the simplicity of my tone. She didn't notice how I lingered on the word leaders. The following morning, the official announcement went public. News outlets ran the story. A private consortium had acquired Adrian's company in a strategic takeover. The name at the center of it, my name, was printed in headlines Elena hadn't yet seen. I drove to the office that day, not as a husband trailing behind his wife's ambition, but as the man who now owned the stage she worshipped. Every turn of the wheel felt deliberate. Every stoplight a drum roll. In the lobby, I signed in with quiet certainty. The receptionist, who had once offered me polite smiles as Elena's husband, now addressed me differently. "Good morning, Mr. Lawson." The boardroom was full. Executives, managers, and staff, faces taut with tension. They expected a stranger to walk in. Instead, the door opened, and I stepped through. A silence rippled across the room. Chairs shifted. Eyes widened. Elena's face was the last one I sought, and when I found it, the world seemed to still. Her glassy stare, the faint tremor in her hand. She'd finally seen me. Not the man she called useless, not the steady husband in the background. Me, standing at the head of the table. I set my briefcase down with deliberate calm and let the silence stretch. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits for the realization to bloom in others. "Good morning," I said, my voice steady. "As you've all heard, there's been a change in leadership. I expect professionalism from this team. Personal matters stay outside these walls." My gaze lingered on Elena only briefly, no longer as husband but as superior. She swallowed hard, her ambition colliding with the reality she had never anticipated. And in that silence I felt it. Not triumph, not gloating, but the clean satisfaction of balance restored. The man she had dismissed was gone. The man she now worked for had arrived. The silence that followed my entrance into the boardroom was electric. People shifted in their seats, papers rustled. A cough broke the stillness. But Elena looked as if the ground had opened beneath her. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. For years she had spoken of me as though I were invisible. Now she couldn't unsee me. I didn't rush. Revenge is never hurried. It unfolds with precision. I opened my briefcase, set my notes in front of me, and allowed the weight of the moment to anchor every gesture. Calmness was my weapon, and I wielded it ruthlessly. "As of this morning," I began, "I assume the role of Chief Executive Officer. The transition will be orderly, stability will be prioritized. But let me be clear, this company will not survive on vanity projects and unchecked spending. That era is over." Murmurs swept the room. Executives darted looks at each other, at Adrian, and finally at Elena. Adrian sat stiff, jaw locked, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles paled. He wasn't used to being anything but the center. He looked at me the way a king looks at a usurper, half disbelief, half rage. "Lawson," he said finally, voice sharp, "you engineered this." I met his stare, steady. I protected it. "Your board agrees." His lips curled. "You won't last 6 months." "Then I'll last longer than your projections," I said calmly. A ripple of nervous laughter ran through the room, breaking the tension just enough. Elena sat frozen, her hands twisting in her lap. She hadn't spoken, not yet, but her silence was louder than anything else. I could feel her pulse racing across the room, the disbelief gnawing at her composure. When the meeting concluded, people filed out quickly, whispering, their faces taut with speculation. Adrian stormed away, his shadow shrinking for the first time. But Elena stayed behind, as if nailed to her chair. Finally, when the room was empty, she stood. "Mark," she said. Her voice cracked on my name. What is this?" I closed my folder with deliberate care. "This is work, Elena. The kind of work you said I'd never do." Her breath hitched. You can't." "I can," I said softly. And I did. Her eyes darted around the room as though searching for an escape hatch. "Why didn't you tell me?" I looked at her then, fully, letting her see the distance between us. "Because you stopped listening a long time ago." She stepped closer, her voice trembling. "Mark, I didn't mean—" "You did," I interrupted, still calm. "Every word, useless, dead weight, a shadow. You meant all of it." Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't move toward her. For years I had chased her approval. Now I understood the futility. She wanted a man who burned for ambition, who lived for status. She hadn't realized I could become that man, and that I'd no longer need her once I did. "I never wanted this," she whispered. "Not like this. But this is what you taught me," I said. "Ambition at any cost, isn't that Adrian's sermon? The one you repeated to me over and over?" She flinched at his name. The pedestal she had built for him had crumbled in a single morning. And now she stood in front of the man she had dismissed, stripped of her illusions. I gathered my papers and walked toward the door. She reached out, fingers brushing my sleeve. "Mark, please. We can fix this. We can—" I stopped, turned just enough to look at her hand resting on me. Slowly, I pulled away. "This isn't broken, Elena. It's finished." The look on her face, shock, fear, regret, all tangled into one, would have shattered me years ago. Now it was only confirmation. My silence had been mistaken for weakness, but silence can also be strategy. That afternoon, the company released the official photo. Me at the head of the table, executives flanking me. Elena wasn't in the frame. She spent the day in her office, blinds drawn, her phone buzzing with messages she couldn't answer. By evening, the news had spread everywhere, online, in papers, whispered at bars. And when she came home that night, the silence between us was unbearable. I sat at the dining table, reviewing documents. She set her bag down, eyes red-rimmed. "Mark," she said quietly, "can we talk?" I looked up once, then back at the papers. "About work or about us?" Her shoulders sagged. "Both." "There's nothing left to say," I replied. "At work, I'm your superior. At home, I'm a man you don't respect. Either way, Elena, I'm done being your shadow." Her lips trembled. "You're leaving me?" I closed the folder, stood, and met her eyes one last time. "No, Elena, you left me a long time ago. I'm just catching up." I walked upstairs, leaving her standing there in the kitchen, the woman who once called me useless now unable to speak at all. For the first time in years, the silence in my home felt clean. The morning after the reveal, the house was silent. Not the tense silence of arguments half buried, but the hollow quiet that follows a storm. I moved through the kitchen deliberately, making coffee, setting my briefcase by the door. Elena sat at the counter, robe pulled tight, staring at her untouched glass of water. For once, she didn't have words. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You're really leaving." I stirred sugar into my coffee, watching the swirl. "I already left, Elena. Last night was just the moment you noticed." Her eyes brimmed with tears. "I was wrong. About you. About everything. I don't even know when I stopped seeing you." I leaned against the counter, calm, steady. "You didn't stop seeing me. You chose not to. There's a difference." She pressed a hand to her mouth as if to hold back a sob. "Can we try again, please? I can change." For a brief moment I remembered the woman I married, the laughter, the warmth, but those memories felt like postcards from a country I'd never returned to. Too much had been said, too much had been lost. "You don't need to change for me," I said gently. "You need to live with yourself. That's enough work for anyone." Her shoulders collapsed inward. She looked so small in that moment, a sharp contrast to the woman who had once stood tall, dismissing me in front of friends, worshipping Adrian's ambition. I should have felt pity. Instead, I felt release. I went upstairs and packed a suitcase. Not everything, just enough. The rest could wait. When I came back down, she was still at the counter, hands clasped as though she were praying. "Elena," I said softly. She looked up. "You wanted a powerful man. You got one, just not in the way you expected." Her face crumpled, but I didn't linger. I carried my bag to the car, the morning light spilling across the driveway. As I slid into the driver's seat, I realized I felt no anger, no triumph, just clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when you finally step out of someone else's shadow. In the weeks that followed, I poured myself into the company. My leadership was quiet but unyielding. I cut waste, stabilized finances, rebuilt trust. People began to see me not as the surprise successor but as the steady force guiding them through turbulence. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a background note. I was the melody. At night, in my own apartment, I'd sit by the window, looking out at the city lights. Sometimes I thought of Elena, whether she regretted, whether she replayed those nights she called me useless. But those thoughts no longer stung. They were echoes fading with each passing day. Because the truth was simple. I hadn't won against her. I had won back myself. What would you have done if your spouse called you useless? Let me know in the comments. I read every one.